project actually came around by serendipity. We were undertaking another project comparing parenting practices in the late 20th century and mid-20th century, and looking through Dennis Marsden's collection at the University of Essex.
And we were looking at a particular study called the Salford Slum Rehousing Study. We started reading the papers and we realised there were references in there to his wife's diary, Pat.
And we just came to realise that she was actually undertaking an ethnographic research project that was facilitating her husband's research. And then we came across mention of Phyllis Wilmot's diaries, and we thought, oh, there's something here.
I'm Sarah, and my mum and dad were Dennis Marsden and Pat Marsden. Pat was a very intelligent person. She was really into research. She was a campaigner, she was a feminist, she was a very strong-minded person, very hard-working.
She came from a very working class background. She was very intelligent. She could have gone on to get a further education, but her father didn't think girls needed to be educated and wanted her to go out to work.
I think when she was young, there were barriers that were put in place, probably by her dad, I think, who was the main person who stopped her from doing the things that she wanted to do, like go to art school, continue in education. So she always felt a little bit thwarted. My mum and dad met in a jazz club in Huddersfield, and I think meeting my dad was a really big thing for her. So, because he was from a slightly more educated background and he was probably a little bit different, and they went to live in Salford.
While she and Dennis were living on the Salford housing estate and Dennis was studying it, Pat kept a diary and she recorded everything about everyday working class life on that estate.
I have looked through the diaries and tried to read a little bit, and I think my mum was sort of trying to immerse herself in the culture and what was going on, and I think it looks like to me that it took her a little while to get to know the other mums and, to be acknowledged, because obviously she would have been an outsider.
Her diary was so rich and so detailed and so fascinating, and there was so much observation of the people that lived on the estate around her and the characters and the children particularly. I mean, she had children in and out of her house.
The children were running around it's a big housing estate, and they are running around on a big sort of field in front of the housing estate, and there's like smashed milk bottles and broken glass. They're eating chips all the time and their clothing is quite poor.
Dennis used her material in reports that he wrote for Salford District Council, the housing department. So she has fed through in those sort of quite undercover ways into his work.
I know that Dennis has read the diaries because it's got little annotations all the way through it, which, I recognise his writing. So he's obviously classifying things. So I've got Pat's CV here, and it does say in 1960 to 68, married and raised 3 children, moved during this period from Yorkshire to Salford, assisted Dennis Marsden in his housing research study in Salford, and after moving to Essex, was sorting out data for his book Mothers Alone. So I think that's proof that she knew she'd contributed. To be honest, I think she was quite quiet about it, so she never really discussed it with us. I never even knew that she'd been so involved, to be honest.
It's much lower key than actually just being able to say, Pat did this, Pat found that, look what that does for British sociology. It doesn't work like that. It's more the intellectual discussion, debate with the husband that then enables the husband to go on and say particular things.
She was never annoyed about it, that she didn't get more of an acknowledgement. I think she probably wouldn't have even expected to have that kind of an acknowledgement, because she wasn't an official academic and she was there to support Dennis, and that may have been enough for her. It wasn't the done thing to be praising people's wives for helping them, and that was just unseen research that was going on. She would have been very happy with the bit at the end that said thank you to my wife Pat.
I am Lewis Wilmot. My mother was Phyllis Wilmot. She was a loving mother to both Mick and myself.
I'm Michael Wilmot. My mother, she came from a working class family in South East London. Obviously, they weren't very well off. And I think that moulded her personality to a certain extent.
And I think that Phil's aim was to move on from that, to try and better herself in a way. Mum met Peter after the war. She trained as an almoner, which is a social worker, and she worked at St Thomas's Hospital. And my dad worked for a Quaker organisation, and I think that Phil went to see Peter at his work about a specific case.
They became interested in each other very quickly, I think.
She actually says, I think I could be happy with this man.
They were perfectly matched. Very early on we moved to Bethnal Green, living above the Institute for Community Studies, which my father had set up with Michael Young. And we lived in the attic there.
I've been up to what was the flat, and it looks out over Bethnal Green. So she had Bethnal Green spread out before her. Phyllis kept two diaries. One was her own personal diary, which is the one where you can imagine her sitting in bed with a fountain pen or a biro, sort of scribbling away in the diary, just actually spilling out all her thoughts. And the other one was a journal of life in Bethnal Green and her observations and so on. Her writing is amazing. She's very honest, and you get a really strong sense of her as a highly intelligent person with really clear intellectual insight, and a very moral person as well.
I think she was very empathetic as well. She obviously built quite authentic connections with the people in Bethnal Green that she lived among.
She and Peter would discuss political and intellectual issues, and they would be debating what the Institute for Community Studies was researching in Bethnal Green.
Phyllis was there, she was at the school gates chatting with the mothers, she was shopping in the local area, she was building connections.
She kept a specific journal that was ready for the Institute to use, and you can see traces of that in the book that they published.
Family and kinship in East London was just such a major study, such an important study in sociology. I think it's probably one of the most famous sociological studies ever done in Britain. And I think it is fair to say that it wouldn't have looked the way that it did without Phyllis's input.
I know there was an influence because they discussed everything. So there was a contribution there from her.
I remember distinctly when the book came out, and Peter and Phil were really excited about that. Look, a book that they had actually worked on for a long time had been published.
It's fair to wonder, would Michael Young and Peter Wilmot have managed to have got that kind of access to working class women's lives if Phyllis hadn't been there building that kind of bridge into the community?
She was a notable diarist, and she kept her diary going for well over half a century. I found myself particularly quoting her in the late 50s, early 60s, which is almost the prime period of that era of British sociology. I mean, after all, Family and Kinship has just been published. Sociology generally is really starting to arrive. And Phyllis had such a lively intelligence, and I'm sure she came up with all sorts of ideas. It's inconceivable to me that she didn't. But of course her name wasn't on the books and so on.
She's described as giving sidelights into the area.
My mother, I believe, and it's no more than that, felt her contribution to the work wasn't properly appreciated.
I don't think it was a problem for her. I don't think she felt, because she would have said, she wouldn't have, if she had felt that she was being done down in any way, she would have spoken out.
Michael Young, in a preface to a reflection that she wrote and on her diaries that it was published, I think, in the early 2000s, he says that she found out more than they did.
I think she was pleased that my father and Michael were interested in her viewpoints, and she would have loved to have been acknowledged properly, but I don't think she actually expected it. I think my mother was frustrated by the fact that she stayed at home, as was the norm in those days, and looked after the kids while my father went to work, and I think she'd rather have done more of the work herself. I could feel the frustration in that.
My gut feeling in conversations I had with her in the last 10 years of her life, during her 80s really, is that there was a little bit of bitterness, that she had had this rather remarkable life, and she had been involved with all these predominantly male sociologists at a time when sociology was really the happening thing. I think she felt just a bit under-recognised, yes, actually.
We also decided on Sheila as a case study because she's an enigma. I mean, she was married to two really prominent British sociologists. It's very clear she was instrumental in their intellectual work, in their field work and so on, but we don't know anything about her.
I'm Lucy Jackson and my mum is Sheila Abrams. She was also Sheila Jackson. She's in her late 80s now. She is very proud as a person, very neat, very methodical. She loves people, she loves chatting to people, she loves being with people. She's very into how she looks and being very smart. Mum was born in Huddersfield, in a working class family in quite a small house, a very busy house, one of those houses that had the toilets at the end of the street and a tin bath on a Sunday when you got your wash. Everybody had to do the chores. She went to school, but only until she was 15. She didn't do any qualifications or anything. So my mum went to this jazz club in Huddersfield with her boyfriend at the time, and that's where she met my dad, Brian Jackson. He was really an innovator, an entrepreneur in his own field, and really was one of those forefathers of sociology. Dad came to Cambridge to do his degree, but she wasn't allowed to come to Cambridge and to leave Huddersfield unless they were married. So they got married in Huddersfield and came to Cambridge the same day. For Mum, I think the move was a complete eye-opener. She really liked being with all of Dad's friends that were academics and that knew things.
When she was married to Brian Jackson, he did a lot of working class community studies, and she had ideas for it. She gathered data for it.
Mum, Dad and Dennis Marsden went back up to Huddersfield and went round the working men's clubs, and the three of them went round and did the interviewing. And I think probably having Mum with them probably helped, but she was also very natural at asking the questions and chatting to people.
When it was eventually published as a book, he makes reference to Sheila in the acknowledgements. She doesn't get part authorship, but he says the book probably would not have been written without her. He mentions how she contributed to the field work, to the writing up, and he also thanks her for her selfless encouragement. After the marriage with Brian ended, she then went on to marry another eminent sociologist, Philip Abrams, and they moved up to Durham.
Philip was very different from my dad. He came from a very different background. He was very upper class, and he was very academic.
And then she was involved in another important study on communes.
And she actually went to live in the commune for quite a while. She stayed there, she slept there. So she really did go to quite some lengths to get to know what it was like for the people that she was interviewing, rather than being an outsider looking in.
In the book, Communes, Sociology and Society, in the acknowledgements, she's credited as having the idea for the study in the first place. She's done a lot of the field work. And it's stated in the preface. I think there's a really lovely quote there from Philip Abrams, and he says that Sheila and the other two researchers did the field work while he studied the literature and tried to maintain a proper academic distance from the real world. After the Commune's research, then Sheila went on to be part of a large major study of neighbouring.
The study of neighbours that, unfortunately, Philip Abrams died before he was able to write it up, but Martin Bulmer, another academic sociology professor, helped write it up. And he fulsomely acknowledges Sheila's role. She was a superb field worker, going out and gathering the data. She was involved in the analysis. In fact, on those projects, she was employed as a researcher, and she was given an office in the department at Durham. Her authorship isn't always recognised, and sometimes it's with Sheila Abrams or Sheila Jackson, which is, I think, unfair and unfortunate.
I think at the time Mum got the recognition she wanted and she believed for the work she was put in, because she was getting it from the people she was working with. I don't think she ever felt that she was below them, even though they were all academics, or that she was different. I think she felt one of them. But if you looked very coldly at the work, at the books that my dad wrote or that her second husband Philip Abrams wrote, then it doesn't really talk about her very much. So in terms of somebody cold looking at it, you'd say no, the recognition wasn't there. But I don't think she expected it.
There's a distinction there between this idea of intellectual, theoretical work, which is seen as something that the men do, and the more kind of practical field work, which is often what the women do. But of course, you can't have one without the other.
So she was absolutely fundamental to those strands of British sociology.
She is one of the best sociologists that we never knew we had.
The wives weren't recognised and their value wasn't recognised. And this is what our project's about. It's about uncovering that.
I think I do agree that people like my mum, Pat, was heavily contributing to some of the work that my dad did, even if she didn't realise it herself at the time. You know, it wasn't acknowledged in an academic way.
They did discuss things and they saw themselves as a pair. They accepted that my father, one, was the driving force, and two, was the one who would go to work, whereas my mother would look after the children. I think she was frustrated by it. I think she was frustrated, which is why she kept her own notes and why she wrote her own thoughts.
For my dad, for Brian Jackson, I think some of his work would have been very different without my mum's contribution, certainly the working class community. For Mum's second husband, Philip Abrams, I think his work would have been incredibly different without Mum's contribution. I don't think it's ever crossed my mind that she should have been recognised more, which feels a bit wrong being a woman. But at the same time, there was that difference between who was the academic and who was taking it and who was, at the time, seen as a supportive role. So I feel very mixed about it in a way.
We mustn't take our contemporary values and expectations and ideas and plonk it on top of what was going on in the 1960s. I think that we can't say, oh, goodness me, they should have, acknowledged their wives, they should have included their wives as co-authors and acknowledged them in more ways.
I think it is really important that sociology as a discipline comes to terms with the significance and the contributions that these wives have made to the discipline. I think it should be acknowledged. There is a discomfort with that figure of the housewife. It's a real anathema, really, to the kind of progressive feminist values that sociology associates itself with. And so there's a sense that housewives didn't really achieve very much. They were just patriarchal dupes. Well, look at how much sociology was actually encompassed in being a housewife.
The argument was that sociologists now need to know about their history of sociology. They need to know whose shoulders they stand upon. And as I read that, I thought, actually, the wives' shoulders were being stood upon too, and they need to be inserted alongside their husbands, not replacing their husbands, but just alongside them in the development of British sociology.